Good morning everyone. Let me welcome you again to this NPTEL course, the History of English Language and Literature. In today's session, having already given an introduction to the Victorian literature in the previous session, we move on to look at Victorian poetry, also known as the Age of Tennyson. Tennyson being the most representative figure of this age across genres, it is also imperative that we begin discussing Tennyson in detail. And before that, we also take a look at the varied influences which had shaped Victorian poetry in the 19th century. These influences were quite diverse in nature. We had also seen how many things were coming together in the beginning of the 19th century onwards to culminate in the eventuality of the Victorian literature, which was inaugurated with the ascension of Queen Victoria through the English throne. Among these varied influences, some of them deserve special mention, those ones being the influence of medievalism, the significance of industrial revolution in shaping the literature and also the temperament of the period, the floating of various kinds of Darwinian theories which challenged the balance between faith, reason and scientific rationality, and also the various ways in which the British Empire was expanding across the world and the way in which Britain was also beginning to emerge as a leading world power. And finally, it is important to note that this was also the period which witnessed the emergence of many genres. It also saw the emergence of different kinds of styles of writing and various themes coming together as well. And from the Victorian period onwards, as we noted in the introductory session itself, it is very difficult to concentrate only on one or two genres, the influence being so varied and so diverse. So, as Hudson began with a caveat when he began discussing the Victorian period, we also begin this lecture with an attempt to provide a bare sketch of the entire period. The important Victorian poets include Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning, Matthew Arnold, Arthur Hugh Clough, George Meredith, William Morris, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Christina Rossetti and Algernon Swinburne. There are of course many minor poets apart from these, but however the central discussion has always been on Tennyson, Browning and Arnold, and these three are considered as the most representative of the Victorian era in general. Talking about Victorian poetry, it is also useful to remember that the Victorian period was not really dominated by poetry. The most dominant genre was novel. So, as the Routledge History of English Literature highlights at the outset, Victorian poetry is generally considered to be in the shadow of the popular genre of the novel, a reversal of the situation in the Romantic age. We have been noticing right from our beginning of our discussion throughout this course that various ages had different dominant genres, but it really did not mean that the other genres ceased to exist. It only meant that there was always a predominance of one genre over the other in most of the literary ages. So, with that note, we begin our discussion on Alfred Lord Tennyson, who lived from 1809 till 1892. In that sense, he is quite rightfully considered as the most representative figure of the 19th century because he lived and wrote almost throughout the 19th century from 1809 till 1892. It is said about Tennyson's influence that Tennyson was to Victorian England what Spenser had been to Elizabethan England, and many other historians and critics were also very kind to compare him to Milton. He is considered as the most conscientious and accomplished poetic artist after Milton. Tennyson began his writing career quite early. In fact, one of his first recognitions was when he was at the age of 20 and also still a student. He received the Chancellor's Gold Medal at Cambridge for a poem that he wrote over there titled Timbuktu. So, thus began his literary career, which spanned over a decade and almost throughout the 19th century. Tennyson was significantly influenced by Romanticism because he was living during a time when the Romantic period also had reached its heights. Tennyson was extremely erudite and he could claim to his credit a wide breadth of classical learning, which also heavily influenced many of his writings and also his thematic and structural compositions. In Tennyson, we can find the poetic exponent of the cautious spirit of Victorian liberalism, and it was because of this reason as well that he is considered as the most representative figure of the 19th century. Though Tennyson lived at an age of transition where there was a tussle going on between the old and the new, he was one among the very few who preferred and opted for the traditional belief systems over the modern ones. And we also see that in spite of this preference of the tradition, he was also extremely delighted and extremely fascinated by the new concepts of evolution which were getting presented from the 19th century onwards. And we find him putting a very persistent belief in the idea of evolution. But it did not really shake his faith. And that was considered as quite an interesting phenomena, because that was a time when many of the writers and even the common people were losing faith in their belief systems and also in the tenets of religion because of the influence of the evolutionary ideas that Darwin had begun to propose. But on the contrary, we find that the ideas of evolution only cemented these beliefs in Tennyson. Thus, interestingly, we find that the belief in these new ideas of evolution only steadied and encouraged him further. In that sense, throughout his writing career and throughout his lifetime, we do not find him losing faith like many others did during the Victorian period. He was also a combination of many different things put together. He was a recluse and an aristocrat, but that did not mean that he was completely away from the ground realities of common life. He was also interested in people and the common things of life. He was rightfully given the position of the Poet Laureate in 1850 after Wordsworth's death, and he also remained in that position till his death in 1892, thus becoming one of the longest serving poets in this post. Wordsworth considered him as one of the greatest living poets and wrote about him that he is decidedly the greatest of our living poets. And we also tend to believe that this compliment was given to Tennyson quite rightfully when we analyze the kind of literary output that he had during his lifetime. It's very interesting and important to note that Tennyson wrote for more than 60 years. And one of the critics of Tennyson, Stopford Brooke, he comments that for more than 60 years he lived close to the present life of England as far as he was capable of comprehending and sympathizing with its movements, and he invoked what he felt concerning it into his poetry. So, talking about the poetic concerns and the thematic concerns that he had as part of his writing career, he was interested in the classical and the romantic and also in modern subjects, and he could also at the same time engage with humble and rustic life, and he was also interested with English history and Celtic legends, and he was also deeply engaged with philosophy and aspects of religion. So, in his poetry we find a combination of all of these things coming together, and he has been rightfully called as the poet who could engage with all these digressing ideas and all these diverse ideas which dominated the Victorian era. His important work Locksley Hall was published in 1842, and in it many feel that the restless spirit of young England is embodied, and it also talks about the faith in science, commerce and the progress of mankind. So, we continue to see a very different personality in Tennyson. Here is someone who is rooted in the traditional beliefs, who never loses his religious faith, and at the same time is enamored by the various ideals of progress and the various ideas of commerce, which is also leading England to a newer phase in terms of world leadership. But however, we do find that Tennyson had to move away and depart from some of these principles that he believed in. A poem which could be considered as a sequel to the first poem Locksley Hall, it was published in 1886, titled Locksley Hall 60 Years After. In this, he begins to show a sense of revulsion towards many things that he idealized in the beginning of his life, and he also began to sense that the rapid development of science was not always positive, but it also began to threaten the very foundations of religion itself. And he also began to realize that commerce was not always a good thing, it also contributed to a lot of greed of gain as well. So, this shifting tendency was not particular or peculiar to Tennyson alone. We find many of the others oscillating between these different principles and these different ideas, because it was a very new vision which was getting open in front of the Victorian England, and many did not even know how to engage with these diverse influences, that they ended up losing their faith or just clinging on to faith in the face of many such threatening things that were coming up. Tennyson's work, The Princess, it grappled with many pressing issues of the contemporary. It also engaged with a very significant concern of those times, the higher education of women and their status in modern society. In that sense, we also find him and many others like him sympathizing with the many concerns that women had during those times. Tennyson is perhaps best remembered for his work In Memoriam, which is an elegy on the death of Arthur Hallam, who was also a very close friend of him and also a poet. This poem In Memoriam was written as a meditative poem, and it also engaged with the Victorian crisis of faith, even when it was primarily concerned with the mourning of the loss of a dear friend. This poem was deeply admired by Queen Victoria herself, In fact, Victoria continued to be a very ardent admirer of Tennyson throughout, and her husband Prince Albert was the one who even instated Tennyson to the position of the poet laureate. Queen Victoria is said to have remarked and even told Tennyson herself that she was much soothed and pleased by In Memoriam after Prince Albert's death. So, after the elegy written in a country churchyard, which was a product of the previous age, In Memoriam became the most celebrated elegy of these times. The other significant works of Tennyson include Maud, Idylls of the King, The May Queen, Enoch Garden and Dora. But he also wrote many short poems which were published together in 1830 which, under the title Poems Chiefly Lyrical. They include poems such as Claribel and Mariana. And he is also best remembered for short poems such as The Lady of Shalott, which also was the cause of controversy for a while. And he also wrote Tears, Idle Tears. It was considered as a poem infused with a lot of pathos and emotion. We do find a strain of romanticism in Tennyson's poetry, but unlike Wordsworth, Tennyson was a person who could see nature with the eye of the poet and the scientist. So, repeatedly we find the influence of poetry and as well as the scientific temperament infusing Tennyson's poetry with a new kind of spirit and a new kind of energy. It's said that Tennyson's approach to nature was more realistic in the sense that he loved its beauty, but he also was aware of the indifference and cruelty that nature was capable of. So, this rational temperament guided his poetry throughout, and it also gave it a sense in which it could come closer to real life. Many also feel that in Tennyson's poetry we can find a reflection of the two voices of the century, the two dominant voices being voices of faith and doubt, which were always in conflict with one another. And there was also as an aid, there was also the two events of democracy, of rationality, of scientific progress, all of those also trying to increase this tussle between faith and doubt. Tennyson was not just a poet, he also experimented with other genres and other forms of writing. We find him writing 3 historical plays titled Queen Mary, Harold and Becket. Though none of these were staged, they did prove his genius and his powers of experimentation. His poem The Ancient Saga, it challenged current materialism and asserted the eternal verities of God and immortality. We find him asserting his faith on eternity and his faith on God throughout. And we do find that was the one thing that kept him sane throughout the Victorian crisis of faith. The classicist in Tennyson could not help but keep returning to the Greek and Roman legends. So, as a result, we find 3 significant works of this time titled Titanus, The Lotus Eaters and Ulysses. And these 3 are considered as one among the best works of the time, and Ulysses continues to be celebrated as a supreme work of not just a Victorian period, but also as a work which foreshadows many things which were about to happen in the modernist period. When we analyze Tennyson's poetry, we see multiple kinds of influences on his poetry. We find that his divided self gets reflected in it. He is also interested in the historical past and the mythological past. His faith in religion, his faith in God and eternity is quite strong, and it is quite evident throughout his work. But he could also engage with science and religion in a way that it did not really take away his faith in humanity or his faith in religion. He was also interested in nature, and altogether he could be considered as a typical Victorian, which makes it all the more right to make him the most representative figure of the century itself. Tennyson is best known for some of his oft quoted lines from his poetry. It is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. There's not to reason why, there's but to do and die. To strive, to seek, to find and not to yield. Knowledge comes, but wisdom lingers. The old order changeth, yielding place to new. We find that all of these lines from his poetry, they have been oft quoted and even misquoted, and this also has contributed much to the development of language and also for enriching the kind of writing that were to follow in the coming decades and the coming centuries. As we wrap up our discussion on Tennyson, let's also quote from one of his well-known poems, Ulysses, which was written in 1833 but was published only by 1842. This is considered as one of the representative writings of the age itself because it captured the essence of what it meant to be a Victorian during that time. I am become a name for always roaming with a hungry heart. Much have I seen and known, cities of men and manners, climates, councils, governments, myself not least but honoured of them all, and drunk delight of battle with my peers. Far on the ringing plains of windy Troy, I am part of all that I have met. Yet all experience is an arch wherethrough gleams that untravelled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. With this we move to the next important figure, Robert Browning, who lived from 1812 till 1889. Here also we find that he dominated the century in almost the same way that Tennyson did. His first work was published in 1833, that since he also got an early start quite like Tennyson. His first work, Pauline, was quite successful and it also led him to devote his entire life to writing. We find his career paralleling that of Tennyson. Paracelsus, published in 1835, was one of the works which ensured his literary reputation forever. In this we find him getting increasingly fascinated by classical allusions and obscure imagery. His work Sordello in 1840 further cemented this reputation that Browning had. Like Tennyson, we find Browning also experimenting with various genres. Accordingly, Strafford was a tragedy produced by Macready at Covent Garden. It was in 1837. His collection of miscellaneous poems was published around the time 1814 and 1846. It was titled Bells and Pomegranates. In 1846, a life-turning event happened to Robert Browning. He married, rather eloped with Elizabeth Barrett and moved to Italy for a while. And in fact, Elizabeth Barrett was also a renowned poet of those times, and she had a better reputation than Robert Browning as a poet then. And together they spent 15 happy years in Italy till Elizabeth's death in 1861. So during the time that they spent together, it was also a fruitful poetic period for Browning. He published Christmas Eve and Easter Day in 1850 and Men and Women in 1855. And after Elizabeth Barrett Browning's death, he also returned to England and continued writing. His Dramatis Personae was published in 1864, and The Ring and the Book, which was a collection of dramatic narrative poems published in a sequential form. It also ran into 4 volumes. It was published in 1868-69. Significantly, Browning's last volume of poets, titled Asolando, was published on the very day that he died, on 12th December 1889. Browning's poetry, many critics and historians feel that they had many obvious defects, but his greatness is beyond dispute. He is someone through his poetry tried to engage with aspects of knowledge, truth, evidence and faith, and the aspect of faith was quite common to most of the writers who were writing during Victorian England. There is also a group of ardent supporters who came up with the Browning's cult, who continued to support and continued to celebrate whatever Browning wrote and published. And his important lyrical work include Two in the Campana, which was concerned with love and faith. We find that the aspects of love and faith continue to be 2 dominant themes around which most of Browning's poetry is constructed. And if we could quote from a line in Two in the Campana, "Let us, O my dove, let us be unashamed of soul, as earth lies bare to heaven above. How is it under our control to love or not to love?" So one could not help but be amazed by the poetic genius through which he could connect aspects of love, religion and faith in a world which was getting extremely torn apart through the crisis of faith and through various doubt-inflicting events. When we talk about the dramatic genius of Browning, it's useful to remember that he almost perfected the aspect of dramatic monologue. Dramatic monologue is something that he continued to write throughout his lifetime, and we find many of the modernist writers also experimenting a lot with this technique of dramatic monologue. And many critics also feel that perhaps there was a significant element of dramatic genius built into the poetic abilities of Robert Browning. In many of his poems, we find that Browning had a wonderful capacity to explore the construction of the self. And we also find that his ironic gaze was often directed inwards. And some of his successful dramatic monologues include My Last Duchess, Soliloquy in a Spanish Cloister, and Andrea del Sarto. And Andrea del Sarto also has this much quoted line, "A man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for?" This was a kind of optimism that oozed from most of Browning's poetry. Browning was an uncompromising foe of scientific materialism. In that sense, we also find a contrasting trait in him compared to that of Tennyson. He continued to preach God and immortality as the central truths of his philosophy of life. And in his poetry and in his life, there was no place for something like melancholy, and that also made him quite different from the poetic genius of Tennyson. And we do not find him even for a moment losing his robustly optimistic faith. And this was a huge reassurance for many of those times who were struggling to hold on to their faith in the middle of the many kinds of crises which were erupting in Victorian England. And some of his best quoted lines also profess this faith that he had in the energy and the kind of belief system that he could gain through religion and through Christianity. And his message to the contemporary society was to hope hard in the subtle thing, that's spirit. Browning's spirit could be best summed up in this single line, which is part of his poetry: God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. And this is in fact his poetic response to the question which was dominating Victorian England, whether life was really worth the living. Let's wrap up our discussion on Browning with one of his famous poems, Child Roland. Child in fact was a term used for an apprentice of a knight. This was a medieval term. We find many of the Romantic and the Victorian poets using and getting influenced by this term. This poem, Child Roland, was treated as an allegory of Victorian heroism in the face of spiritual uncertainty. There they stood, ranged along the hillsides, met to view the last of me, a living frame, for one more picture. In a sheet of flame I saw them, and I knew them all. And yet dauntless this luck horn to my lips I set and blew. Child Roland to the dark tower came. It's only appropriate that we move on to discuss Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who was also the wife of Robert Browning. She overcame an early romantic influence, especially that of Byron, and turned to social themes of class and women. She in that sense could be considered as a very different kind of poet with a very different temperament, particularly because of the gender differences. And we also find him not following the major tenets of the day and also departing significantly to talk about class differences and also gender parity. Her most important work, Aurora Lee, was published in 1857. It was a loosely structured work. It said that she never had the firm coherence that her husband Browning had. But however, it was full of intense moments, and this also made Aurora Lee an instant success. Though she did not live throughout her lifetime within England, she was a very popular poet and she enjoyed much popularity during her lifetime itself. But however, later when the canon was shaped, we do not find her being accorded the status that Browning later got. Aurora Lee was considered as a novel in verse, and it was also about the life story of a woman writer. And many feel that Aurora Lee by Elizabeth Barrett Browning anticipates Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, which was a modernist text to be published in the 20th century. And many celebrated this also as a female prelude, prelude being one of the important works by Wordsworth. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's work had a very significant concern, which also made her different from most of the Victorian writers of the day. She engaged with suffering, poverty, exploitation and courage, did not invest much of her energy to talk about the many dilemmas of, many abstract dilemmas of faith and reason and doubt. And we also find her talking about the differences between the elites and the lower classes and trying to highlight the need to somehow overcome all of these differences to progress towards a more democratic and a secular kind of world. In fact, it was very interesting that she saw this obsession with the past as unhealthy. And we find her being quite unlike others, including Browning in this aspect, because in Tennyson's and Browning's poetry we notice that there is a continued fascination with the past, and we find most of them continuing to live in the past and almost looking at all of those things quite nostalgically. But Elizabeth Barrett Browning was a poet who argued that the poet needs to represent the age and accordingly live in the contemporary or talk about the present age rather than roaming in the past. Her important work, published in 1850, titled Sonnets from the Portuguese, though it was a translated work, it was also a record of the stage of her love for Robert Browning. So, having taken a look at the three important poets, Tennyson, Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, we try to wrap up today's session and will also continue the discussion of the same in the following session. Thank you for listening. I look forward to seeing you in the next session, where we continue to look at the other major Victorian poets.